First question. Your earliest memory of politics is when you got your hands on a Nixon bumper sticker. Can you tell me what happened?
Well, it was 1960, and I was for Nixon, and I got a hold of a bumper sticker and put it on the wire basket of my bicycle and rode up and down the street in Arvada, Colorado, thinking this was a powerful way to get votes for Nixon. The little Catholic girl who lived across the street, however, was wild for Kennedy, and when she saw me with my bumper sticker riding up and down the street, she pulled me off my bike, put me down on the concrete, and wailed the heck out of me. Gave me a bloody nose. I would add, she had about 30 pounds and a couple of years on me, otherwise she wouldn't have won. But my first experience in politics.
In 1971, you were chosen to be executive director of the College Republicans. Mm-hmm. What was your role on President Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign?
Well, our object was to organize and encourage campus Republicans to get active in the campaign and to basically canvass the campuses to try and identify this as the first presidential election in which 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. And so we were working like heck to identify and get out the vote. The myth was that the Vietnam War had basically kept the Republicans from winning the youth vote, and yet Nixon essentially split it with McGovern, lost the campuses, but won the non-campus vote. But we spent essentially 1971 and 72 doing everything we could to sort of mobilize kids on campus to come out for Nixon.
You were at the 72 convention, mm-hmm. and it was your first convention. Can you describe the scene on the way there, and what was it like to listen to President Nixon?
Well, I was working at the Republican National Committee, and our staff offices were in the Fontainebleau Hotel, the headquarters hotel, where our job was to have a ready cadre of student volunteers to help in the mechanics of the convention, to stuff things and to make things and run things from point A to point B. So the night of President Nixon's acceptance speech, I was given by the head of the convention, Joe Good, like 46 tickets, which was like more tickets than the Kentucky delegation had. I was sort of a favorite of hers, so she sort of in return for having done good work, she gave the college Republicans these tickets. So a friend of mine, Jim Dyer from Tennessee, and a couple of others, two other people, one that was the chairwoman from Colorado and a fellow from, I can't remember what state, took 4 of the tickets. We distributed the rest of them, got in a cab and went down Collins Avenue to the convention center. The cab driver, however, got lost, got outside the security cordon, and we ended up in the middle of the rioters. And the fellow kicked us out of the cab and turned around and made a hightail right out of the riots. But here we were, 4 college kids nicely dressed in the middle of a rabid mob, and so we made our way as quickly as we could to the fence, and then up the fence towards the secure entrance to the convention center. And I remember there were demonstrators around us with large sticks, and they kept pounding the pavement and making gestures towards us that weren't friendly. And we got close to the gate, and one of the kid froze up. And I'll never forget, the college Republican chairwoman from Colorado took this kid, whipped him around, and slapped him and said, "Let's go," and sort of grabbed him, almost carried him on her back, and made her way to the gate. And Jim Dyer and I, followed in her train, and they made a. At this point, it was getting sort of dicey because they were now they were throwing things over the fence, bags of pig blood, and they were starting to sort of get really menacing with these big long sticks towards us. And a group of National Guardsmen wearing gas masks and with bayonets made a foray out of the sally port in order to surround us and get us into the gate. And once we got into the gate, the president was arriving, and the blades of the chopper dispersed all this tear gas that had been shot off to keep the demonstrators away from the gate, or from the fence line. And so everybody, here were all these delegates and alternates and convention guests making their way into the hall of the convention, the Miami Convention Center, with tears coming out of their eyes from the tear gas that had been sort of blown around by the president's helicopter. But it was a pretty amazing night. I mean, tens of thousands of people in the arena. Nixon gave a fantastic speech, and you walked out of that place thinking everybody in America was going to vote for him, and frankly, almost everybody did. I mean, it was a huge landslide.
He won 49 states in 72?
Right, everything but Massachusetts, and then just barely lost it. If McGovern was really boosted by the anti-war effort there more than any place else.
What do you think Republican candidates have learned? Because that campaign was kind of unprecedented. What have they, and what can current candidates learn about that historic campaign?
Well, the resources matter. This expenditure of resources. Nixon was well funded, and he made certain that an effort was mounted everywhere. Even historically Democrat states, we now think of the South as reliably Republican, but in 1972 they were not. And so, you know, he worked hard in places like Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama that had been historically Democrat. He also carried the battle to, you know, states that were historically blue-collar Democrat, like Michigan and Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And then he just left nothing for granted. I mean, the campaigned aggressively throughout the country, particularly in states like New York and Minnesota that had been Democrat, and the message that he had, which was that he was a peacemaker. The trip to China had crystallized in people's minds his diplomatic skills, and you couple that with the wind down of the Vietnam War, it was a powerful message in opposition to that of McGovern, which was, you know, I'm the only person who can end the war. And then Nixon had, you know, focused on the economy and the domestic front in a way that allowed him to reach over and get a bunch of Democrats. Here was the man who created the Environmental Protection Agency. Here was a man who had a good stewardship of the economy in difficult times. So we look back now and see Nixon more through the prism of the events of 1973, but the American people saw him in a different way in 1972.
You had mentioned the youth vote. In an age of draft dodging, you know, widespread student protest and campus radicalism, how did he do so well? I mean, he nearly got half the whole youth vote. What was his?
Well, it was to engage on the issues. I mean, we had you know, the president gave a lot of ammunition to his allies. I mean, we could point to his efforts to wind down the war in Vietnam and his efforts to establish a new relationship with China, which we now know in retrospect were really key tied together in a very key fashion. But we could also point to his domestic agenda and say here was somebody who was forward-looking and who was you know, changing America in a positive direction, and particularly things like the EPA and his conservation initiatives found a lot of support on campus. But look, it was dominated by a big issue, the war. You were either for the war or against the war. You were either for Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, of making the war more dependent upon the Republic of Vietnam defending itself, or you weren't. You either wanted to stay and get the job done or you wanted to get out. And particularly non-students were clearly in the latter camp, and even on campuses it was deeply split.
You say that campaigns are won by big ideas. That's one of the first of the 8 hallmarks of a Rovian campaign. Right. Did President Nixon in '68 and '72 did he run Rovian-style campaigns? Well,
in '72, yes, because the idea was I'm the peacemaker. In '68, it was you know, it was I will have a plan to end the war. I mean, it was you know, we've got problems in our country with riots at home and dissent about the war abroad, and we need to change that. And it wasn't. He didn't want to lay out a lot of what that was about. I mean, he felt that in a 3-way contest he'd be damaged by doing so. So, '72 is more of a Rovian campaign than '68, if that label applies.
One of the things that's interesting about the 24/7 news cycle today is that candidates seem to rise and fall. You had Michelle Bachmann. Right. Now you don't have Michelle Bachmann. You had Rick Perry, and he's starting to, when he's descended.
Right. Now we got Herman Cain on the ascent. Yeah.
Richard Nixon, he ran in '60 and in '62 the gubernatorial race against Pat Brown. He lost both of those campaigns. Right. But it wasn't a permanent descent. He's one of the most, he served on 5 presidential tickets, probably one of the most durable campaigners of all time. Kind of an anomaly in politics. Why was he able to bounce back? Why do you think he was able to bounce back so
well? A lot of it was will. I mean, he had a determination. I mean, things that would have broken a lesser man, like the loss in 1962, didn't break Nixon. He was also a keen student of politics. He understood how someone could rise and why people fell. And for example, after the '62 loss, he reestablished himself in New York, and then very carefully in '65 and '66 went out to help a lot of people run for office and win, knowing that it would pile up credits that would help him if he made the race in '68. And even in '68, remember, he's not the front runner in 1967. George Romney of Michigan is, until he implodes in a series of unfortunate remarks at the Republican Governors Association meeting in August of 1967 in Idaho. You had Nelson Rockefeller, who was seen as a significant candidate, represented a big state, had access to a lot of resources. You had Ronald Reagan making a last-minute bid for the presidency. So Nixon understood how to operate in a crowded field, and he wasn't, he didn't get unsettled by that. He was surrounded by about a bunch of very smart political people. The future Attorney General Mitchell, probably the most significant among them, but people like Bob Finch and Haldeman and Ehrlichman and others. And when they got in a tight circumstance like they were in the '68 presidential contest, they didn't come unraveled. They stayed focused on what it was, what needed to be done in order to win, and that started at the top.
Do you think, with all of the, and you have an unpopular president, you have economic problems in this country? Yeah, you have your Occupy Wall Street. I mean, you have a pretty divided political climate. Is 2012 anything like 1968?
No, not really. I mean, look, Occupy Wall Street is, has taken over one private park in the lower part of Manhattan and gotten 700 people to go out on the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, the riots of 65, 66, 67, and 68 were an enormous convulsion. The controversies over civil rights, I mean, the death of Martin Luther King, the riots on campuses and the protests against the war were on a scale that make Occupy Wall Street look like a walk in the proverbial park. So no, I think much different, much different. The country, it's hard for people to understand how deeply divided the country was then in a very fundamental way over issues of race and poverty and war. And we've seen, fortunately, nothing like it since.
What do you feel, and this is the last question, what is President Nixon's greatest legacy?
I think the opening to China and the recognition that in order to win the Cold War, we needed to continue the strategy of containment, but operate in a more nimble fashion to begin to pit the strains of communism against each other, to play the Sino-Soviet divide in a way that over the long haul increased China's willingness to look to the east, that is to say to Europe and the United States, and also isolated further the Soviet Union in a way that made it impossible for them to maintain themselves. And it reshaped the world, and that's a pretty powerful achievement.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.